Hi, I'm Justin Moorman.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. All right, welcome back. Episode 22, Dear Mama, Trauma-Informed Parenting. It makes it sound like we're going to be the experts on parenting in this. I don't think that's really the case.
Absolutely. We are not the expert. I want to speak for myself.
I was going to say, I'm actually doing pretty well, but I've got a longer time to be able to look back time frame. My kids are older, right? So I can look back on a longer time frame. We're doing well.
Yeah.
The verdict's still out on you guys. Your kids are still young.
So we don't know how they're going to turn out. So.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah. We'll do a follow-up episode in a few years and assuming that we're still doing this. I don't know. We will be probably, maybe. If we made it. I don't know. I don't know what we're talking about anymore. Okay. Hey, Dear Mama, Trauma-Informed Parenting. Let's get going. We're going to be talking today just about how all this trauma-informed knowledge, I guess, carries over into the parenting world, into the at-home world, how it kind of has carried over for us specifically. Obviously, we can't talk just wide strokes, super broad strokes, but I think like how does it carry over? What are things that families can implement? How can it look at home? And I think there's actually a lot of crossover between what we talk about in schools and how it can look at home. Yeah. Obviously, there's some differences too, and I think that's going to be what we kind of talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. As we talk, like educators, not all, but a lot of educators are parents. So we do trauma-informed training at school, but so many of these skills, and actually how I got into trauma-informed care was not through education, not through my job. It was through parenting.
Yeah.
So that's how I got into Dr. Ross Green's work, and just my first daughter, she has ADHD, and just like parenting her was different. Like plan A was not working. So part of my husband and I getting on the same page on how to approach her, like as we're learning, or your first child, right? You kind of get on the same page about what does discipline look like? How are we communicating about this? What are our boundaries? How are we addressing things? We read The Explosive Child by Dr. Ross Green, and I really got into trauma-informed care through that lens as a parent. And then I was like, oh, all this stuff applies to kids at school, and here's how this can work at school with kids, and here's things I did, and here's why, going through the lens from parenting. So just kind of interesting entry point for me, which probably looks different than what yours was. You were doing the work and then had kids, so that's interesting.
Well, I was doing the work and had no idea. I was doing a lot of things that I'd learned from people that had been doing it for a long time. I was in one of those kind of fortunate situations where I was by far, the least experienced, youngest kind of person in my setting, and was learning a lot, doing a lot, but a lot of this, like the brain science and a lot of this work in general wasn't necessarily out yet. And so I kind of I found myself in a spot. Then we had kids, right? They get older, but I found myself really in the spot where I'm like, well, let me learn why some of this stuff is working and what I'm doing is working, why, or what I'm doing at home maybe sometimes wasn't working. Again, like that first kid is always hard. You don't really know who they are. I was actually just talking to my brother about this yesterday a little bit. He's got younger kids, and I told him yesterday, I'm like, well, that's the thing. You're going to feel like you get a system with your oldest, right? And then your second one comes along and they age into the world of like being more of a person, not just an infant, toddler, a little bit older, preschool age. And you find out like, well, this used to work for so-and-so. It does not work for my second kid. Like, because it turns out like every person's different. Like, that, but you're like, oh, this is how. You kind of almost fall in the spot. You're like, this is how I parent. And then you're like, oh, but this doesn't work for them.
And that also worked in a dynamic of one. And then when you have two or three kids, those dynamics, you can't, duplicating some of those things are tricky.
All right. So what are some of the transfer over or did you cover them already? I don't know.
Oh, no.
We kind of seamlessly did that. But
yeah, I know. No, I was just saying that.
Or maybe we didn't. Apparently we didn't because you didn't cover them.
No, I didn't cover it. We're just getting started. The transferable things over to like the home setting, right?
Yeah.
So if you have trauma-informed education, you're trying to do this work in schools, how can you transfer some of the stuff over, when you're at home? But I think in some essence you can't because when you're at home, that's real life, right? You have lots of hats you're wearing. When you're at work, it's a solo lens. Your only job and responsibility is to do that work there. When you're at home, you're also like house, food, you need rest, regulation, family activities, right? Like there's a lot of different dynamics going on at home. So I think take the pressure off yourself that why you do this so well at work. I've had a hard time with that. I do really, really well at work with somebody else's kid, right? But then there's some reality that your home is a place of rest, that you can't always duplicate all the things we talk about at home, but there's some intentional things that you can do. But just, keeping that in perspective, that you're human, and
Yeah,
that's, and
absolutely.
really, and we're all, we're all making it. So just, your home is a place of rest. So just thinking about, I think when your home feels dysregulated, seems a little crazy. So start thinking about some of those lens, the vocabulary, like my house feels dysregulated right now. My child's dysregulated. How can I co-regulate with them? I think some of those are great. I mean, early infancy, that's essentially what you're doing as a parent. You're co-regulating with your
Sure.
children. Don't forget that as they get older, they still need the
Yeah,
co-regulation.
that doesn't stop. It just changes how it maybe looks sometimes. And even sometimes, again, as they get like just marginally older, it doesn't necessarily look wildly different, right? Like
Mhm.
those toddlers still like a good go-to move, right? Is picking up, rocking, things like that. That still is so helpful. I mean, I think kids seek that out, right? They run over, they hold their hands up, pick me up, hold me, things like that when they're hurt, when they're scared, and so I think lean into that a little bit and recognize that that stuff doesn't necessarily just drastically shift, but it's more of like a slow phase to how it shifts as they
Yeah.
get older.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the older, maybe you're sitting on the couch with them as you're talking as
Yes.
teenagers, right? That's co-regulation right
Yeah.
there. As we think about transferable skills, don't forget about the stress response system and how fight, flight, freeze, fawn, right?
Hmm.
Those things. Think about how your child responds to stress. So
What's fawn?
fawning would be like overly pleasing,
Mm.
like always having to feel like they have to serve or do something with kids. If you hear Dr. Perry ever talk, he says fawning is actually one of the most concerning ones. The over people pleaser, where they feel like they just have to do for people all the time,
Sure.
where they're so afraid to make disappointments from
Yeah.
anybody.
Yeah.
That's also a stress response
Yeah.
for some kids.
I just felt like people may not know that. They're pretty familiar with the other three. I feel like they
Yeah,
may not have known that one.
we did a
It
parent.
wasn't about me. It wasn't about me not knowing.
I figured, considering you worked under, you've been trained with. But we did a parenting thing for our families at our school, or couples schools, and one of the things we talked through is just how different our kids were even respond. So, my first daughter is more of a fight or flight kind of thing. Will just get really upset when she's.
Yes.
My other one freezes. Like, you can't rationalize whether you have to pick her up and regulate her before I can even. She just freezes, like, it literally cannot move, like, in the moment when she's upset. And so just really thinking about your kids and how their stress response system is activated and what happens, and then having some plans in
Sure.
place, just like you would do with kids, and knowing yourself so well that when you are dysregulated, yelling louder or more is not going to help solve the problem. They're not
Yeah.
going to move any faster or get things done. And I do it all the time still. Like, trauma-informed parent, I'm the worst at it. I call myself out on it all the time, or my husband will be like, you just said, right?
Yeah.
So
I
I think,
thought you always tell me. Yeah.
yeah, isn't it? But I think that's part of it, and like really focusing on, like, if you're not in a good spot, you need to walk away. You've got to walk away.
Yeah.
But that's part of teaching, right? The same transferable skills. You've got to think about, if you're not in a good spot, tap out. Get somebody else to tap in for you if you can. I think part of, we talk about environmental factors, societal ways. Some people don't have a tap out person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's hard.
Yeah, if you're a single parent or you don't have like family support, then not having that option to tap out. I think this is part of our societal cycle we're going through, that there isn't enough support for people. As we know, humans are really designed to grow up in villages and all that kind of stuff, and other cultures and that kind of stuff. So that's a tough spot to be in sometimes if you can't tap out. So think about some strategies you can put in place, a place you can walk away and go to if you don't have that option.
Yeah. Yeah. And like helping your kids know probably too, I think talking about stuff like that when obviously depends on the kid's age too. I get that, but talking about some of that with your kids to let
Yeah.
them know, like, hey, I'm not necessarily like super mad or whatever else, but like there might be times if you say this to me, I know you need space. If I say this to you, just know that I need 5 minutes,
Yeah.
before we start talking about whatever again. I think it's good to like come up again, planning ahead and being proactive, I think is always helpful overall. I mean, because otherwise you're reliving the cycles over and over again and then kind of like just feeling bad about it later. And that's not helpful to anybody.
Yeah.
I think like parenting is hard. Like we talked about being an educator and being a parent. I think what's hard is you do feel like you're better at it. Like we talk about this with people at work all the time, but you feel like you're better at it at school than you are at home. But I think that's not a school specific, kind of thing. We have a friend of ours that's a nurse, and might even be like a what's like a level above it's not
A
a doctor.
PA.
Yeah, maybe a PA.
Yeah.
I could be wrong on that, but she knows her stuff, right? And she'll call us and be like, our daughter like got hurt. This is what she seems like. What do you think I do? And like all the time, I'll look at my wife and I'll be like, so it's interesting. Like we have no medical, like I'm not like a medical professional like this. I can tell you what I would do as a parent, but like you're a medical professional. But I think like some of our training goes out the window when it's our own kids, right?
Absolutely.
It's really tough.
Too close to home.
Yeah, and I think that's true in a lot of situations for people. Like it's true. I've heard many nurses talk about that, or doctors talk about that. And I think sometimes, we cut ourselves some slack too. Like it's almost like you're too close to the situation, right? You're like, okay, well, I've lost perspective at this point.
Now I have I have
yeah.
emotions and feelings and love for this little person or big person now. That how do I look past me? My primary job is to protect them, and it's not really to evaluate those needs.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it can be hard though. Yeah. Okay, so like, what are some of the intentional? Were you done with that one? I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can go on.
All right. I felt like I was plowing through. Yeah. All right. So what are some intentional practices that families can put in place to help support their child then?
Co-regulation.
Yeah.
I think we can't say that enough. That's the essence of it. I think try to be as steady as possible to keep the rhythm of your household. I struggle with this sometimes. You get busy, right? And then it doesn't, like the rhythm's off for the house. So think about your work schedule. Think about what you have going on ahead of time. I've had to really intentionally, which a lot of guilt. I don't know, for some reason you feel like you have kids, you should have them in every activity possible.
Yeah.
And you feel like, I almost feel like sometimes there's judgment of like why I don't have my kids in a ton of activities. But just knowing about like their full school day and stuff, like they are in like one thing. But that's because the rhythm of our household, I can't imagine my kids wouldn't, behavior wise, wouldn't be able to make it to be going for school and every night we're gone doing something.
Yeah.
So just think about your kids and what their tolerance level for things are, and give yourself permission that it's okay that they don't need to be busy every single night.
Yeah.
If that's where your kids are at. So I've had to let that go, but that's huge to keep the rhythm and the steadiness in our household.
That was my first thing too, was like, don't overschedule yourselves. Right.
Yep.
And I think it's for the kids. Yes. But it's also for you.
Yeah.
Cause then all of a sudden you're in a situation where you're like, every night we're running somewhere, and then you're that much less regulated as well. And then you wonder why, as we're driving through McDonald's to try to get food for dinner for the 8th straight night, you're like yelling at your kids, and all the things, right? Because we've overscheduled ourselves. And I think societally that's a problem. And I think we're actually shifting. I think this next generation of people who are having younger kids now, I don't know what generation that is called, but like whatever that group of people, that age group, I think they're correcting where it has been like kind of off in the overscheduling world. I think there's more of a desire to kind of correct that and not overschedule. So I think there's hope in that, but it's that it's maybe swinging back in the other direction a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's so much to be said. We say this all the time as educators, and then and having families, like, have a consistent dinner time if possible, that your family, like, if intentionally, we know there is so much research out there about if your family can eat together at night for
huge.
20 minutes, whatever it is, but just 20 minutes to connect where we're not having TV or devices on.
That's what I was going to say. Without everybody holding a phone or watching a TV.
Yep. No electronics on, right? Sitting and just talking for 20 minutes about your day and sharing conversations. I mean, that's so, so important. So the routines, and if you normally have a routine at night, we talk about routines for kids all the time, even with young kids, bath, bedtime, books, whatever that is, even when the routines change. I'm learning that as my kids get older. You probably can speak more to this, but before we were filming, I was talking about our routine when they were little, which it can't be that routine anymore because they've grown. It changed, but there's still such a systematic routine of knowing who puts me to bed and what that looks like for each of them. And that's really important to keep steadiness and that rhythm in the household.
Yeah. It makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Makes a really big difference. Yeah.
That creates the predictability. We know predictability lowers kids' stress, your stress, the intentionality of resting, that sometimes this weekend we're actually not doing anything this weekend.
Yeah.
I always feel like you have to obligated to go take them to the zoo or go do whatever. Sometimes it's okay to be like, you know what? We've had 2 really busy weekends this weekend. We're actually... we're not doing anything.
Just take it easy.
We're going to take it easy, which took me a long time to figure out that was okay.
But I think, what that does too is like that builds in, like if you don't do that when kids are young, like, and throughout your kid's life with you at home, then what they basically have learned is like, I have to always be on the move as well. And it's almost like, and then it creates that for for them as they grow older as well. Like, whereas if they can learn and we can help teach them, like, hey, like kind of got to kind of entertain yourself a little bit, figure out what to do. Like, what could we do that's just outside at home? What could we do? I think that all that stuff is so valuable, like long term too. And I think short term, it could be uncomfortable though. I've talked to people before that are like, well, the kids kind of just drive me crazy if we don't just go and do a bunch of stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but you got to also start looking short term versus long term, right? Like short term, that might ease the annoyance or whatever it might be. But like long term, what's it teaching them? You know, and what are they learning from that about how life is supposed to look long term from us?
How do they do that self-care? Yeah. How do they regulate themselves?
Yeah.
How it's good for your kids to have creativity time, right?
Yeah.
My kids live for times of just having a box. They are always doing something with a box and decorating.
A lot of boxes at home.
Yeah, like just doing things like that, and that's okay. And I think if you're having a low-key weekend, try to be intentional about like screen time, like that it's not like we talk about rest versus disassociating. Yeah. So make sure it's not a whole weekend of disassociated time where we're just we binged watched whatever. I mean, not that can't be part of the weekend.
Sure,
I live for it like everybody else, right? But we've really had to like set some. I think we talked maybe I don't know, I feel like 2 years ago or whatever. I was having a hard time with the screens with the kids.
Yeah.
And I think maybe even you gave me some good advice, was like, think about like the times, like when everyone's off. And so we do on the weekends, we have times where everyone is off. The TVs are off in the house. The screen times are down. Yeah. Think about other things that you can do that have nothing to do with screen time. So think about the intentional rest versus dissociating for the entire weekend. Think about problem solving with your kid. This is really the foundation of Dr. Ross Green's work. So hopefully Josh will amazingly add something on here for him. But his organization, Lives in the Balance, he really supports educators, schools, but families. I have learned so much through Dr. Ross Green and his work, and really that the plan A, B, and C, that not every kid responds to traditional parenting, and that you really have to look at problem solvings with them and actually listening, because we think we want to fix it for our kids.
Sure.
And it's really not it's not even the issue. Yeah. That is not changed from school to home transferable. Like kids, you still need to problem solve with your kids and teach them how to solve problems.
Yeah.
Isn't that ultimately
that's one of mine too, which I'll jump in now.
Yeah.
Like for that, like as opposed to just repeating it later, right? But I think, don't brush those aside, because I think what we do is it's hard. And especially as kids get older, you know, like it can be harder. They don't want to talk about it. Like I've got one of my two really hates having to like relive whatever negative thing they experienced, right? So maybe they get into it with each other. My two kids get into it with each other. He'd rather just have it be done.
It's over.
And then not have to talk about it again. And so he'd rather avoid it. And so it's hard. Like we have to like purposefully have them sit down and be like, but you've got to like work through it, and you've got to actually tell him how it made you feel, and you've got to tell her how it made you feel, and then you've got to recognize that, and what could you do different, and you've got to actually talk that through, because what we've realized and seen so much is that not only to kids we don't do a great job, we haven't historically done a great job of teaching kids how to work through conflict, but then we see the product of that is a bunch of adults that also don't necessarily know how to work through conflict. And again, that's not a school specific thing, that's a go out in the world and accidentally bump somebody's grocery cart with yours and watch your back, you know, like, cause all of a sudden people don't know how to like handle conflict very well. And so, I think that's super important. Like do that hard thing. And if you don't know how, like if you're sitting here thinking, oh, that'd be great, but like, how do you do it? I mean, again, like whether it's Ross Green, like it's all kinds of things out there that can talk you through, hey, how to like work through a tough situation. One of our episodes was like post-crisis. Post-crisis. Like this doesn't have to be like intense, but there are concepts in that episode even that are like, hey, what do you have to do afterwards? After there's a conflict, after there's something that didn't go well, what do you do? Yeah,
that goes back to the heart of restorative practices.
Yeah, sure.
Right? Like just really acknowledging feelings and sharing back and forth, and then what's the plan for the next time when your kids are regulated. So when you're having, I think we can't stress this enough, when you're dysregulated, a kid's dysregulated, you can't co-regulate each other anymore. If you're regulated and your child's dysregulated, you need to co-regulate them first. And when they're in a good spot, sometimes we'll circle back the next night at dinner and say, hey, we're having problems in the morning, getting up and getting ready and being on time. Or what are some things that we all can be accountable for to start problem solving with the kids because it's in the morning when I'm screaming because
That's what I
I'm
was
going to
gonna
be
say, 'cause
late.
it's not the morning.
Because that
Yeah,
happens
that's
because
not the
I
time to
am
do it.
not a perfect parent. I'm screaming, let's go. I'm going to be late this morning. Get your stuff on. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's not the time to make the plan for, you know what, every morning from now
No,
on, here's exactly what we're
what's-
going to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not the time. Right?
That may come out of my mouth, but I didn't mean it.
Sure. Yeah. 'Cause you're going to say some crazy stuff.
So-
And then you either feel like you're stuck doing that and you're like, well, this was a mistake.
Yeah.
Or you go back on it and the kids unfortunately learn like, oh, mom, dad, whatever. They just say whatever and they're upset, but it doesn't really mean anything.
They don't fall through any of it.
Yeah.
And how this is also coming to my head, like how powerful to apologize
Yeah.
to your, like, I made a mistake today. I'm sorry, I yelled at you today and I shouldn't have. And that's
Yeah.
not how you should have started your day. And that's on me. We're actually late today because I didn't get ready in time. It's actually my fault and not yours. You
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean,
that stuff
there's-
makes a difference.
I think owning and showing you can also apologize and own your stuff. I think that's hard sometimes.
I think in that same vein and kind of along the
Yeah.
same lines, like I think writing out those tough times with your kid, like sometimes you can have, you know, if you are in a family that has two parents, right? And you're co-parenting with somebody, you know, living that kind of world. Obviously one that's hopefully super helpful, but I think the other side of it is like you can let yourself get into a rhythm where it's like one parent is the one that like is with the kid when they're really upset through the tough time, and then the other parent, because we talk about this at school all the time, is the one that's like, well, they don't listen to me, or they don't like they won't like follow through with me, they don't tell me things, you know, as they've gotten older, you know, now they're a teenager, well, they only go to you, they don't come to me. Well, have you written it out with them? Have you shown them that you're willing to be that person that's with them in those tough times? And that can feel very harsh, I guess, to say, but I think there's a reality to that, right? And so certainly don't force yourself into a situation where you're like super upset and you're with your kid that's also super upset and you're both just really mad. But hopefully there are times that you build in where you can remind yourself, I don't actually have to solve anything with my kid right now that while they're really upset, but I can just be here with them calm. Because there's a freedom in that. There's a freedom in knowing like I don't have to solve anything. Because sometimes as parents we feel like we have to solve something. We have to make this stop because it's uncomfortable. Like nobody likes to hear a kid scream and yell. Nobody likes to hear their middle schooler mouth off to them, you know, over and over again. Nobody likes to hear the high schooler tell you, you know, whatever. But sit there with them through it and let them know like, hey, I'm with you kind of through thick and thin, and this is where I'm at, and we're gonna get ourselves to a good spot, and then we're gonna talk about it, or we're gonna like address it enough to move on, and we'll talk about it more tomorrow or whatever else. But I think be willing to like ride those tough times out.
Yeah, that's so important because we see this same cycle at schools, right? Where it's always the person takes and does all the relationship
so if
work.
there's one parent that's always taking, or maybe it's like I always pass them off to like the grandparent when they're really upset. Whatever it is, if you're always passing off your child, like a child when they're really upset, they're for sure, not like in a mean way, they're not going to look at you and think like you're an awful person, but they're for sure going to like have that part of an attachment with whoever's riding tough moments out with them. That's just how it works.
That's how it works. I thought about providing activities to promote regulation and expression. So put those systems in place in your house, whether it's art or music, taking your kids outside in nature and walking. We talk about that a lot. But just produce those independent regulation skills. And then not feeling shaming. Like, oh, it's not that bad. Or I think we're all real guilty of telling kids how they should feel and not whether it seems irrational or not, right? I mean, sometimes you're like, that's absolutely not true, right? You're being irrational about it. But if they feel that way, I think it's important not to feeling shame and acknowledge their feelings. You can talk through them and say, oh, actually, do you think maybe that you're actually feeling nervous or anxious is what I heard you when you're processing through things, but they're building their emotional vocabulary. They're learning about their bodies. Their bodies are changing, but acknowledging their feelings and talk through that. I am guilty of that. That's saying like, you shouldn't feel that way, or you're being ridiculous right now. Yeah.
I always tell the story like our daughter for the longest time, every now and again still, but like for the longest time she would come in and she'd be so little and she'd be like, I'm just sad. And we're like, why are you sad? Like, what is happening? Like, what happened? Did something happen? And we eventually found out, like we talked about interoception, like she found out she was hungry.
Yeah.
We'd be like, are you sure? Have you eaten for a while? Do you need a snack? Yeah, maybe I'm hungry. And I'm like, oh, I was like, okay, well, that's different than sad. Like, you know, or like, I'm just feeling like kind of mad. And you're like, are you hungry? And you're like, yes. And you're like, oh, so like, but like little kids, like they might need, you know, to be told, you know, not told what they feel, but helped through understanding how they feel.
Yeah.
And that there's different specific names for certain things. Like, and it sounds wild to us sometimes, that has to be a thing, but it does. You might have to explicitly teach,
Yeah.
kids how they feel and what the name is for that.
And where do you feel it in your body? These are
Sure,
some warning
yeah.
signs. So when you start feeling this again, let's put some strategies in place so that we aren't flipping our lid or having the big break. That's the hard part about younger kids, is that they're haven't developed those things yet to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So just really getting them to start body awareness and not making them feel bad for expressing their feelings or emotions.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you feel like it's different? I want to ask you a question now.
Yeah.
Parenting question. Do you feel like you are harder on your son than your daughter? Like, because I have 2 girls, you have a boy and a girl. I'm thinking about just like societal, like men having emotions and those kind of things. Do you think you've had to be intentional about, but they're both 2 different kids, right?
Yeah, they are. I don't think so. We talked about having spouses on for this episode, and that wasn't a thing that happened.
Yeah.
But, so maybe my wife would say differently. I don't think so. I mean, I think it's been like, the hardest thing for me has been like learning what their differences are.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, one of my kids may need way more help, even verbalizing what they say. One might quickly verbalize what they say, and they may need more help being like, yeah, but you also have to like hear the other person's perspective. Maybe somebody wasn't yelling at you. Maybe you also weren't following a direction for 8 straight times that we asked.
Yeah.
And so then all of a sudden we're a little bit more stern. So I understand that you're feeling bad, but that doesn't mean,
there's no
that somebody was
boundaries.
like yelling. Yeah, like you still have to come through. So I think it's just different, right? Like where one of my kids can, man, I could yell at him. I could do whatever, and they were going to give it right back to us. And one of our kids, is one of them's a fight, one of them's a flee.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like one of them, literally just this week, one of them got up and felt like they were yelled at, was how they described it, and ran to their room and closed the door and locked it. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, but you had to get ready for. We were just saying like it was time to turn this thing off. That was it. Like nobody was yelling at you. Do you want to see yelling?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
so that didn't happen. That's not how it happened.
That wasn't the move.
No, well, I've learned it isn't, right? Like I've learned that isn't the move. I've learned it's more like, okay, now let me explain to you, and I am sorry that you felt like I yelled at you, but that's not my natural instinct. My natural instinct is suck it up. Like I don't know what to tell you, but like but I've learned like that, hey, that's not the best way. And do I really want to drive like a wedge in between me and my kid? Because I'm stuck on like how I feel like it should be, or do I want them to consistently feel like they can tell me exactly how they're feeling about stuff?
Yeah.
Because if they can't tell me exactly how they're feeling about something I've done, I always like my concern would always be, are they going to come to me when they're middle school or high school or whatever and tell me how they're feeling about other things that are maybe like a lot more important? I want to make sure that's open,
Yeah.
And so I think you're always playing a long game as a parent. I think my parents would probably say the same thing currently with me and my 2 brothers, right?
Yeah.
You're always playing still a long game. I mean, because you're looking to see how it is when your kids are 40, when your kids are 50, like that's what you're doing all this for. And so you have to remember that, because it can be frustrating in a moment, just like it is in a classroom. It can be frustrating in a moment to be like, this moment feels out of control and I'm very frustrated.
It's a season.
We all have our tough times, and we don't listen. All of us have bad reactions as parents. That's just a reality of it. But we hopefully can recognize like, hey, I can be better, and how can I shift and change?
Yeah, and make them easier. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Just was wondering about the boy girl dynamic.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Well, and again, it's almost flipped. The one you would think would be like the harsher, like intense one. It's not.
It's the
boy.
opposite.
Yeah. And so then the one that I approach a little bit more gingerly is maybe not the one that society would guess.
Yeah.
One of the things I said was be purposeful about building your relationships with your kids too. We talk about being purposeful about building relationships with kids in your classroom. And I think sometimes because I was thinking about this a lot, like why is that maybe a problem? But I think we have our kids, they're infants, right? You can't really, not that you're not building a relationship with them, you are, but really you're just keeping this little teeny baby alive is what you're doing. Yeah. And yes, that's relationship building. But then at some point, like if you don't pay attention to purposefully building a relationship with your kid, at some point you've just kept a kid alive. And not that you're not interacting with them or whatever, but are you just like coexisting, like cohabitating the same house, and you're kind of in charge of them, or have you taken the time to really purposefully build a deeper relationship with them? And I've watched both. I've, throughout life, you know different people, and I've seen people that do a really great job of like intentionally building a relationship with their kid, and then I've seen people that maybe haven't, and I know that I've learned I want to try to really intentionally build a relationship with my kids, and but that's hard to do. You have to do it on purpose. Again, we have a whole episode about that. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but go back and listen to an episode on how to build relationships in your classroom. Same thing. Do the same things.
Yeah, I've even noticed like just life gets busy, right? You're going from one thing to the next, whatever. And I was like sitting down and just had one of my girls out for lunch, and I was like, but my head was like somewhere else.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here, I'm like, oh my God, what a waste of time. Why am I thinking about that? And I'm not like, right now. Here I am. I have this direct time to be mindfully present. I think I've tried to be more present about catching myself doing that. And like, this is great. All that stuff doesn't matter. I have some, unconditional time with her right now that I just really need to pour into that. Getting to know her as a little person, and her little person, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Help her along, right? Yeah. How do I help them along in this? How do I help them along in how they think about something?
Yeah.
How do I take the conversation and I will say this, my wife's better at this, I think, than I am. But like, how do I take the conversation? Just this week, there was something that came up at dinner, right? Yeah. We really do try to have dinner with each other every night.
Yep.
And something came up at dinner, just a comment like that was, about something that's going on at school. And then my wife at the end of the night, because her bed, she was like, hey, did you ever circle back and talk to, our one about that? And I said, no. And she was like, well, I was asking her about it, and here's kind of what she was saying and all the thing, and so I think you get insight, and then like you kind of help your kids, though you're teaching them how to like navigate life, right? How could somebody else be thinking? Because again, that's not how any child thinks, even through high school, realistically. You're thinking
some adults don't.
Well, yeah, sure. Yeah. But you're very like self-centered ultimately. And so you're teaching them, like, how do you have empathy? How can you, like, what do you think their perspective on that was? Why do you think they might be doing that? Like, what are some things you could do to make sure that doesn't happen in the future? All those things like that to help them think through. And you can't know that stuff if the kids if you're not talking to your kids and providing time for them to be able to speak to you about what's going on in life,
Yep.
And so I think that's important. So what's hard for you? What's a struggle you have as a parent? Like I forget how the question's worded, but like, what are some of the struggles within parenting for you?
I think giving myself permission that I'm just human. I can't be perfect because my personality types. I'm a goal setter. Everything's gonna be great. I'm gonna get it all done. I think personally, I have a lot on my plate sometimes, and I feel like, and I think I've had some breakdowns about this. Like, I feel like I'm failing at everything.
Sure.
I'm failing. I'm not a good mom right now. I'm not a good wife right now. I'm not a good friend right now. I'm not a good principal right now. I'm not a good teacher right now. All those things, because you juggle all that stuff. So I think I feel like sometimes I'm failing my kids, or I feel guilty about not maybe being there enough, or because just the busyness of the demands of my job and things like that. So there's some guilt there. I think struggling just sometimes remembering the stuff we talk about in trauma-informed care. Like, I don't need to be yelling right now. I need to be patient. We need to put systems in place, be more intentional. If, like, fighting in the bathroom every night, getting a bath, let's not get baths together. Like, why am I, like, the insanity of why do we keep on doing the same thing? Or some of those things. I think what I've done well is foster two really independent children that really have really cool little personalities and really can take care of themselves and all those things, but really still struggling through patience, right? Like everybody, and giving myself permission to, like, it's okay that I'm not perfect. Definitely hear this. We are not perfect parents.
No.
Yeah.
No.
You hear about a lot of our,
hear
a lot about our epic failures.
Yeah.
But
I think staying calm, that co-regulation piece is tough sometimes, because again, you're like a little bit more invested in it. I can always a little bit perspective wise be like, well, like at school, this kid goes home at some point and I go back to my house. So I can do a lot of stuff for a few hours. Like, I can do a lot of stuff. Like, I can put up with a lot of stuff for a few hours and like keep myself in a good spot. It's always different when you're at your house. I mean, because it's your kids or whatever. And I think that's also a little bit of the hard part, that if you are, and I've talked to several teachers who have kids that are their own kids that are older than mine. And just to kind of get perspective and their insight and all of this. And they're like, some of the hardest years that they had teaching were years that their kids were the same age as the students they taught. Because then it's like you almost don't get away from it. Like it's one thing when like if I'm teaching, middle school and then my kids are infants, and preschoolers. Okay, like that's one thing, and like but then because you're dealing with different types of problems, two completely different types of problems. But then like when all of a sudden your kids were middle schoolers, if you're teaching in middle school, then you're like, well, now I got the problems at school, at work, right? And then I'm dealing with the exact same problems at home, time frame wise, and like those are just hard times, like because you're never away from it.
Yeah, that makes
and so
sense.
that's a little bit hard, I think, sometimes. And I'm kind of like I'm in that time frame right now, right? Which again, it's actually hasn't been bad, but yeah, it's I think that's hard sometimes when it's just all day then is with kids of the same age band. Like if you spend all of your day both, and then you don't get away from it on the weekend because you're with your own kids in that same age band. Like so you pretty much 100% of your time, unless you're at home and your kids are asleep or whatever, like you're pretty much with
that level of development all the time.
And that can be hard. Like that wears on you at times.
Yeah. I was thinking too, just as I was looking at my notes, just another really hard struggle I think I've had is just getting other family members to understand the shift of how I approach my kids.
Sure.
I think comes with, especially if you grew up in a different type of discipline household or, culturally different discipline household. I think that's probably been one of my biggest struggles. It's like, well, actually, I don't do that.
Yeah.
And here's why. It's not that I'm not disciplining my kids or and so making that lens shift with other people so they understand, like, so we're all on board on how I've decided to approach my kids really through the collaborative and proactive solutions kind of, and regulation and all that kind of stuff. Like, I'm actually not going to scream at them right now. I'm not going to physically discipline them right now because that's not going to help, right?
Yeah.
I think some of those, but getting called like generational type things, like getting people on board to understand that lens shift of how I choose to parent and why the science behind it. It's just the same thing with school. It doesn't change in school because why are you not suspending kids and putting them on the line at recess, right? Same thing, right? It's because brain science does not support any of that.
Yeah.
So I'm going to parent through a lens of the neuroscience supporting my parenting.
Yeah, and what's hard about that too is the fact that like parenting is a touchy subject, right? It's because it's very personal, right? And so even if it's not said, like people can feel like somebody is saying you're doing it wrong. So if I watch somebody, even if I'm not really interacting, if I'm watching somebody do it different, and they're doing it different than I do it, like I could start to feel, and you watch people start to feel like, well, just the act of them doing it different themselves is somehow saying that I'm doing it wrong. And so then I almost have to like defend myself or hate to say attack, that sounds really strong, but like kind of attack their style, And I think that's, I don't know, like one thing I've took away from my parents through a whole story that doesn't need to be, well, we don't have time for, we're already going longer than what we normally do.
Yeah.
But like, is this idea that like, hey, every single person's different. Like every kid, you could try to raise your kids the exact same way, but hey, newsflash, every kid is different.
Yeah.
Because they're all different people. And so you have to have slightly different approaches. And you can't really judge parents based off of what choices their kids make, because their kids are also individuals. So parents can guide, and I think but as kids get older, you lose some of that control to guide, because kids get older and they become
more independent.
More independent.
Yeah.
And so you can't always just look at parents, because I think we can get bad about that sometimes, like looking at parents and be like, well, they did it bad, or they must have messed up, or they must have done whatever. And that's just not the case. All right. So what do you think our spouses say?
I actually asked mine.
Well, I did too. Yeah.
Okay. This will be interesting.
Am I going to just guess? Yeah.
I think my husband Mike said to expect me to know as you do. Like, remember, I don't have a degree in educational neuroscience. This is not what I do for a living. And just because I don't do that way doesn't mean my approach is wrong and yours is right.
Sure.
Just become, which I have heard.
And then you guys had a fight.
And then we're actually not actually living now together anymore. That was the end of that.
I was talking to Melissa, and I was just asking her, she took a different approach, but she was saying some of the stuff that she's learned ultimately because of hearing me talk. I mean, I can talk about stuff a lot, and I always like to share, like if I've learned stuff, that's kind of my move. I like to share stuff I've learned. And so she catches that. Sometimes it's stuff that she does not care about in the least. And sometimes it is, she patiently listens to me either way. for the most part. But she was talking about the brain science stuff, that she's really learned. Like that's what she feels like she's learned the most about, like just being in a house with me and like having to really remember that. She said one specific example she reminds herself of a lot is that a person that's super dysregulated really can't even hear you at that point. And she has to remind herself that a lot with our kids.
Yep.
When probably one more than the other, but like when one is like when they're really amped up, that really just saying more in those moments harder doesn't really help anything.
Yeah.
Like that she's got to just wait. And she said that's been super helpful. And then the other idea is that stuff doesn't have to be solved in the moment, but that it's super important to circle back around.
Yeah.
And we talk about that a lot at school in general. And I think that is, and you already touched on it today, but I think that's a super important concept. Like you don't have to talk about it right this minute, but it is important to like address things.
So what I'm hearing is that we're basically a joy to be married to, and we've got 2 lucky people.
People love us dearly.
Yeah.
That's my baseline feeling about how people feel about it.
All
All right. Well, hey, what do you want people to walk away from this episode knowing?
I think it's okay. It's for educators. If you're a parent out there too, that it's okay just to be your child's parent. You don't have to be their teacher.
Yeah.
Those are 2 different hats. I think I had to you have to let some of that stuff go. Be present, be authentic, be predictable, be steady, be intentional, and give your best. And what your best is each day. Today's best is not going to be tomorrow's best. So just know that, and that think of your priorities, and does your time reflect your priorities? This is a goal of mine.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
It's a good one in general. Yeah. I just thought that parenting's hard. I think people need to hear that like a lot. I think parenting is hard, and parenting's hard in different ways at every stage, right? Goes from like, hey, it's hard because I'm not getting any sleep and it's crazy and like our whole world's been turned upside down because we have this infant, and like to it's hard because like when do you start like disciplining your kid? How does that look? How do we teach our kid to like do the right things? Like when does that time start? Like then it's like, oh, how do I help them through school? Just never. It's always gonna.
Am I ever gonna be able to have time where I'm not worried about who's watching or taking care of you?
Yeah, right. And it's always, but it's hard, and it's always hard for different reasons. And everything I've heard from people that are, that have adult children, like it doesn't stop like being hard, right? Like there's different things, or there's different things you worry about, or there's different ways you want to care for your kids, but it doesn't stop just because your kid hits 18 or 25 or 41, right? Like you're constantly in that mode working with your kid and trying to help them out. And I think that's tough. And so it's parenting is an incredibly tough job. And I think that a lot of the stuff that we say about teaching and working with students crosses over. So listen to other episodes, but cut yourself some slack, give yourself a lot of grace. We say that a lot, but I think it's true because parenting is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Yeah. And find your village. So every family dynamic looks really different. So we're lucky we're able to co-parent with somebody, but whether it's a co-parenting relationship from afar, or if it's a grandparent that's helping out, or a friend, or find your support network as I think we keep on going back to their previous episode, right? Like you need to have a support network. So figure out who that is to help your system run so that you can stay regulated as a parent too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. Well, hey, we appreciate you hanging with us and having this conversation with us about parenting. It's a little bit of a different one. I think we probably could have kept going forever. We kind of started to push our way through there towards the end. Let us know if you've got questions. Always, if you've got comments, definitely just reach out to us. We love that. And again, hang in there. If you're a parent, hang in there. And if you're an educator, just last little note. Remember that parenting's hard. So for the parents in your room,
have grace for your parents.
Yeah, like just remember that. Like it's tough, and everybody's trying to do their best. And so like remember that you're part of that team. Part of that team this year. So. Remember, for sure, reach out. Let us know what you need, what questions you'd like us to talk about, how you'd like to interact with us, or what concepts you'd like us to talk about in the future, right?
Yep.
Let's go out there and do the work.
Let's go do it.
Hey, everybody, let's keep the conversation going.
Like and subscribe below and keep the comments rolling.